I think everyone should take seriously the things that the president says, because even though he often says things that sound, outrageous, they are then often followed up as reality, or he tries to make them reality. So, I think it's something to take seriously, because he's now said on more than one occasion he's interested in this idea of maybe we'll send some U.S. citizens to El Salvador and, the really horrible prison that they have there. And, I should just say that no one should be sent to that facility. That facility, violates all kinds of international norms on the bare minimum of treatment for any human being. And so, the idea that we would send anyone there is outrageous. But he is floating the idea of sending U.S. citizens, and his press secretary tried to dial back a little bit on that. She said, well, he would only do it if it's legal. And, so if he was going to follow what the current understanding of the law is, he absolutely could not do that. He could not send you can't deport an American citizen. You can't, as punishment, take away someone's citizenship.
Is it possible to take somebody who is a United States citizen, because we become incarcerated, or formerly incarcerated for that matter, is it possible to renounce our citizenship, to take and to relegate us to a foreign prison?
Not under current law. So there's a Supreme Court case, Trope versus Dulles, where the Supreme Court said that you cannot remove someone's citizenship as a form of punishment. So, assuming that case stays as good law, there's no reason to believe that the Supreme Court would overrule it or backpedal on it. That is the law, is that you can't take away somebody's citizenship as a form of punishment. Now, the issue with this current administration, and this is where things get a little scary, is they often want to push the envelope of what they can do, or they want to try to change settled understandings of what is and isn't legal. And most frightening of all is that kind of flirting with, or maybe even actually disobeying Supreme Court decisions or not complying with Supreme Court orders. So in the current climate right now, we know there is a man from Maryland who the administration has said should never have been sent to El Salvador. It was a mistake, because there was an order in his case that said he could not be removed to El Salvador. That was a valid judicial order in his case, and the administration, removed him anyway, and sent him to El Salvador. So he has filed legal proceedings. They made it all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court of the United States issued a decision that was signed by all 9 justices that said the administration needs to facilitate his return to the United States so that he can get his due process rights, so he can get a hearing, so it can be decided whether or not he can be removed. The administration has disobeyed what the Supreme Court said. They have not facilitated his return to the United States. There's a hearing before a judge right now in Maryland, and she is beside herself because she has said, you've done nothing. You, the administration, have done nothing, and the Supreme Court ordered you to facilitate. So I think the scary part is this administration certainly seems to be testing how much it can get away with in terms of disobeying things the Supreme Court says. So although I can tell you there's this Supreme Court case, Trope versus Dulles, that says you can't take away someone's citizenship, the fear is this administration just saying, so what? So what if there's a Supreme Court case? What are you going to do about it if we actually decide to do it? Anytime the government has ever said it was only going to carve out some kind of punishment for the worst of the worst, that never happens. It always expands to cover just about anybody anyway. One of the things I actually talk about in the book that I've been thinking about a lot lately is when the Supreme Court decided the case of Salerno, which was the first time that the Supreme Court recognized that you could detain somebody who was presumed innocent before they had been found guilty, based on this idea that they're somehow dangerous just because they'd been arrested for a crime. That was for 200 years. The idea was, of course, you could not do that. That would violate due process and our Constitution. But, the Supreme Court said it was okay. And when they did that, the government had argued before the Supreme Court, we're only going to detain the most violent people, the most dangerous people. Those are the people we're going to detain. Maybe it'd be 10% of the federal prison population, because the law the court was considering was the federal bail law. Well, I'm here to tell you the reality today in America, 75% of all federal defendants are detained pretrial. It is not the most dangerous, the most extreme. Like
Yeah.
that is just so that is a false promise. Whenever anyone hears that, I just encourage you to look at history, because it is just not true that we're as a country have ever been very good at just reserving things for the worst of the worst and the most violent, the most depraved. That's not how any of this operates. It always expands, and it always expands to include, frankly, just about anybody that's in the general orbit of criminal justice in America. What happens if after someone is sent to this facility, how do we keep track of them? How do we know anything about them? Currently, there's one person at least that we know of that has been completely lost track of. Yeah, this man, he was employed as a hairdresser. People have no idea where he is. It looks like he's disappeared off the face of the earth. And that's why you can't hand over, your own citizens to another sovereign and just like say, well, that's their problem now. That is certainly incompatible with our constitutional order and how we think about things. The worry, though, is right now what the Supreme Court has said so far is once someone, though, is outside, once the mistake has been made. So, in the case of Mr. Abrego, who's the man from Maryland, he should never have been sent over there, the Supreme Court said, look, we're not saying you have to, we're telling the executive how to do its job. We're just saying you have to facilitate his return. And so that's a little wishy-washy, because what that means is, first of all, they're not facilitating, but let's say they even said, well, we tried, they said no, so, there's nothing more we can do. That would be the same response if it was an American citizen. Like there's nothing about anything that's happened so far to Mr. Abrego that's really, other than the fact that, he himself is someone who is an immigrant. The fact that the administration is saying once someone is over there, we can't bring them back, that would apply to citizens and non-citizens alike had they been sent there. So because they're claiming, the administration's claim is not, we can't bring Mr. Abrego back because he's a citizen of El Salvador. Their claim is we can't bring him back because he's in the custody of El Salvador, which is what happened when all those people on the plane were turned over to El Salvador. And so if an American citizen had been on that plane, the administration's argument is exactly the same. And that is actually one of the things that Justice Sotomayor pointed out in her dissent. She said, we should take a harder line on this because everything the administration is saying could apply to U.S. citizens as well. So, I think it's a very scary time. I wish I could be more reassuring. I can be reassuring in the sense that the law is clear that you can't remove someone's citizenship. What is less clear is, what do you do if you have an administration that seems to not respect the law very much?